My child, I see you. I see the quiet moments when the world finally stops demanding things from you and you're left alone with the silence. I know what happens in that heavy, suffocating stillness. You let your shoulders drop. You let the brave mask slip from your tired face. You stare out the window or at the ceiling, feeling an invisible weight pressing down on your chest. A burden so heavy you can barely draw a full breath. You have convinced yourself that you must be strong for everyone else. You believe that if you reveal the cracks in your armor, if you admit that you are struggling, everything you love will fall apart. You carry it all in secret, smiling when you want to weep, nodding when you want to scream. But I am watching you, and my heart aches with a deep, consuming love for you, because you were never meant to carry this all by yourself. I know the exact number of tears you have fought back, and I know the exact sum of the fears you have locked away in the darkest corners of your mind. Let me tell you about a man who tried to build a fortress out of his own strength, only to find himself trapped inside it. There was another who thought he had to hold the world together all by himself. His name was Elias. He was 45 years old, a man whose hands were rough and calloused from decades of honest, relentless labor. For 15 years, he had poured his entire soul into his small-town hardware store. To the rest of the town, it was just a place to buy nails, paint, and lumber. But to Elias, it was much more than a business. It was the foundation he had built for his family, the legacy he intended to leave behind, and the ultimate proof of his worth as a provider. He had missed family dinners, given up his weekends, and sacrificed his sleep to keep the doors open. But on this particular Tuesday evening, long after the open sign in the front window had been flipped around to read closed, and the last employee had swept the floors and gone home to their supper, Elias was not building a legacy. He was standing behind the worn wooden counter, entirely alone, surrounded by the familiar scents of freshly cut pine machine oil and cold concrete. The only sound in the cavernous building was the steady, rhythmic ticking of the old clock on the wall. For 15 years, that ticking had been a comforting heartbeat to him, a reminder of steady progress. Tonight, however, it felt like a relentless countdown. I was there with him in that quiet space, just as I am with you right now. I watched as he slowly made his way to the back office, his boots scraping softly against the scuffed linoleum floor. He stood under the single flickering fluorescent light, the harsh illumination deepening the lines of sheer exhaustion that were etched into his face. The office was small and cramped, filled with the clutter of a man who spent more time working than organizing. Spread out before him on his scarred metal desk was a mosaic of colored paper. They were invoices printed in harsh black ink, final notices stamped in urgent red letters, and formal letters from his primary suppliers, demanding payments he simply did not have. Elias picked up a thick statement from his main lumber distributor. His thumb, permanently stained with wood varnish, rubbed over the bolded total at the very bottom of the page. It was a number that had grown like a stubborn weed, quietly choking out the meager profits he had scraped together over the past 3 months. He set it down gently, as if the paper itself were fragile, and picked up the mortgage notice for the building, then the utility bill, then the insurance premium. He reached across the desk for his old plastic calculator, though he already knew the devastating math by heart. He punched in the numbers, the plastic keys clicking sharply in the oppressive quiet of the room. He subtracted the bills from the shrinking balance of his business account, subtraction after subtraction, until the small digital screen glowed with a negative number that made his stomach turn cold. The business was failing. The undeniable truth was staring back at him in green digital light, and no amount of hard work or clever accounting could change it. He gripped the edges of the metal desk, his knuckles turning stark white. His chest tightened painfully, as if an iron vise were slowly closing around his ribs. I saw his quiet panic. I felt the exact moment his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, desperately throwing itself against a cage. He was a man who prided himself on being the anchor, the one who always figured things out, the one who never let his family down. He lived by the belief that a good man fixes his own problems. But in this cold, empty office, he was finally hitting a massive wall. He could not climb, break down, or walk around. The reality was suffocating. He could not fix this. My child, this is the very place where I wait for you, at the absolute end of your own strength. I gently whispered to Elias's weary spirit in that quiet room, pleading with him to trust me with all his heart and not to lean on his own understanding. The deepest danger of relying solely on your own wisdom is that your vision is so terribly limited. You see only the storm. I see the soil being watered. You see only the failure. I see the foundation being cleared for something new. But Elias, much like you do, when the fear becomes too loud, could not hear my gentle voice over the roaring of his own pride. He believed the devastating lie that asking for help was a shameful sign of weakness. He convinced himself that if he just worked a little harder, if he just found the right angle, if he just endured the stress a little longer, he could engineer his own rescue. He looked at the mountain of debt on his desk and made a tragic calculation. He decided that the most loving thing he could do for his wife Sarah and their children was to shield them from the terrifying truth. He thought he was protecting them by carrying the secret all by himself. But my child, listen to me carefully. The heaviest weights in this life are always the ones you refuse to share. When you isolate your struggles, when you hide your pain in the dark out of a misguided sense of duty or a deep fear of judgment, you do not banish the darkness. You only lock yourself inside the room with it. Elias was relying entirely on his own understanding, unable to see that his hidden struggle was already beginning to erode his spirit from the inside out. He thought he was building a protective wall around his family, but he was actually building a prison for himself. He stood there in the office for a long, agonizing time, staring blindly at the pale wall, the deafening silence of the empty store pressing in on him from all sides. Then, with a slow, heavy sigh that carried the weight of a broken dream, he made his choice. Instead of falling to his knees and surrendering the burden to me, instead of reaching out to the heavens for grace, or reaching for the telephone to call his wife and confess the reality of their situation, he gathered up the pile of past due notices. He swept them all together with trembling, calloused hands. He tapped the thick stack against the desktop to straighten the edges. And then he pulled open the heavy bottom drawer of his desk. He placed the mountain of bills inside, pushing them far to the back, hiding them safely underneath a stack of old, useless inventory logs. He closed the drawer with a definitive heavy thud. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small metal key, and turned it in the lock. He locked the truth away. I watched as he slipped the key back into his pocket, effectively locking his own heart away in the very same motion. Elias turned away from the desk and walked slowly over to the small rusted sink in the corner of the office. He turned the handle, letting the icy water run over his hands, and splashed it onto his tired face. The shock of the cold water forced him to take a deep breath. He grabbed a rough paper towel, dried his skin, and then looked up at his own reflection in the smudged mirror above the sink. I watched him practice the geometry of his features. He forced his clenched jaw to relax. He commanded the sheer panic to retreat from his eyes. He pulled the corners of his mouth upward, practicing the familiar, reassuring smile of the strong, capable husband who had everything perfectly under control. He was putting on the brave face. He was preparing to walk into his home and lie to the people he loved most, simply by saying nothing at all. Satisfied that the mask was securely in place, Elias tossed the paper towel into the trash bin and walked out of the office. He moved methodically down the main aisle of the hardware store, his footsteps echoing in the dark. He reached out and flipped the heavy breaker switches one by one, plunging the organized aisles of hammers, nails, and paint into total darkness. Finally, he reached the glass front door. He flipped the heavy brass deadbolt, pushed the door open, and stepped out into the cool, quiet evening air. He walked toward his worn-out pickup truck completely unaware that the heavy secret he thought he had locked safely inside the store had already followed him out the door, ready to ride the entire agonizing way home. The drive home was a quiet, suffocating journey. The worn tires of his old pickup truck hummed a low, steady rhythm against the dark asphalt. But inside the cab, the silence was deafening. The dashboard lights cast a faint, pale glow across Elias's rigid jaw. He kept both hands gripped tightly on the steering wheel, his knuckles pale, as if the physical act of driving required every ounce of his concentration. Beside him, resting in the empty passenger seat, was the invisible, crushing weight of the secret he had just locked away in his desk drawer. It sat there like an unwelcome passenger whispering his failures into the cold air of the truck. He turned onto his street, the headlights sweeping across the familiar, quiet lawns of his neighborhood until he pulled into his own gravel driveway. Before him stood his house. It was a modest two-story home, wrapped in white siding with a wide front porch. Golden, inviting light spilled from the kitchen windows, cutting through the chill of the evening. To anyone else, it was simply a house on a quiet street. But to Elias, it was a sanctuary. It was the place he had sworn to protect, the life he had promised to provide for. I watched him sit in the idling truck for a long moment, staring at the warm light of the kitchen window. He placed his heavy hands over his face, drawing in a long, ragged breath, holding it, and then slowly letting it out. He was rehearsing. He was pulling the mask of perfection tightly over his fractured spirit, making sure there were no loose edges, no visible seams where his panic might show through. My child, how many times have you sat in your own car or paused with your hand resting on the doorknob of your own home, taking a deep breath to compose a face that does not match your heart? How many times have you prepared yourself to walk into a room full of people who love you, determined to perform the exhausting role of someone who is perfectly fine? I see the immense effort it takes to carry that illusion. I feel the deep, silent exhaustion of pretending. You convince yourself that holding back the truth is an act of love, an act of protection. But I tell you now, hiding your struggles does not build a shield around your family. It only builds a wall between your heart and theirs. Elias finally turned the key, silencing the truck's engine. He stepped out into the crisp night air, walked up the wooden steps of the porch, and opened the front door. Instantly, the cold, metallic dread he had been carrying was met by the enveloping warmth of his home. The comforting scent of roasted chicken and thyme drifted from the kitchen. The low murmur of the evening news played on the television in the living room. It was the picture of a perfectly peaceful life, a stark and agonizing contrast to the storm violently raging inside his chest. "Elias, is that you?" Sarah's voice called out from the kitchen, soft and familiar. She stepped into the hallway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Sarah was the steady anchor of his life. For 22 years, she had been his partner, his confidant, and his greatest source of comfort. Her eyes were warm, lined with the gentle creases of a life spent smiling. But they were also incredibly perceptive. She knew the cadence of his footsteps. She knew the exact set of his shoulders when he was carrying a heavy load. Elias forced a smile, an expression that used the muscles of his face, but entirely failed to reach his eyes. "Hey, sweetheart, just me." He walked over and kissed her cheek, the scent of her lavender soap, a brief agonizing reminder of everything he was terrified of losing. "You're late," she said gently, stepping back to look at him. Her gaze drifted over his face, searching the subtle lines of tension around his mouth. "Dinner's been keeping warm in the oven for an hour." "I know, I'm sorry," he replied smoothly, slipping off his jacket and hanging it on the hook by the door. His voice was steady, practiced. "Just doing some final inventory counts, trying to get ahead of the spring rush. You know how it is." He washed his hands at the sink, letting the warm water run over his skin, desperately trying to wash away the feeling of the late notices and the red ink. When he sat down at the small oak dining table, Sarah placed a warm plate in front of him. She sat across from him, resting her chin in her hands. Her own dinner, already finished. She did not look at the television in the next room, and she did not look at the clock. She only looked at him. "My child, I have invited you to walk in the light. I have promised that if you walk in the light, as I am in the light, you will find true fellowship with one another. But the darkness is deceptive. The darkness tells you that your shame is too heavy for anyone else to understand. It convinces you that if the people you love truly saw your failures, their love would break under the weight of it. Elias was sitting just 3 feet away from the woman who had promised to love him for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer. Yet because he chose to sit in the darkness of his own pride, he was entirely alone at that table. Elias picked up his fork and began to eat, chewing mechanically, the food tasting like dust in his mouth. The silence between them stretched, losing its comfortable familiarity and taking on a heavy, fragile tension. He could feel her watching him. He could feel her intuition working, picking up on the unseen frequencies of his distress. Sarah reached across the table and gently rested her hand over his, stopping his fork mid-air. Her touch was warm, an open invitation. "Elias," she said softly, her voice dropping to a register of deep, intimate concern. "Where are you tonight?" He looked up at her, feigning confusion. "What do you mean I'm right here?" "No, you aren't," she replied, her thumb lightly tracing the back of his calloused hand. "You've been a million miles away for weeks. You're barely sleeping. You're quiet. When I look in your eyes, it's like you're bracing for a hit. Is everything okay at the store? Are you okay?" The truth was right there, hovering perfectly on the tip of his tongue. He could have turned his hand over, woven his fingers through hers, and let the walls collapse. He could have told her about the mortgage, the unpaid suppliers, the shrinking accounts, and the suffocating fear of failure. I waited in that dining room, hoping he would choose the light. I gently urged his spirit to surrender the heavy shield of his pride, to let her be the partner she was meant to be. But the fear of disappointing her was a louder voice than my gentle whisper. The pride of the provider rose up like a thick iron gate slamming shut against his throat. Elias pulled his hand back just an inch, just enough to break the connection. He offered a light, dismissive chuckle, waving his hand as if swatting away a harmless fly. "Sarah, you worry too much," he said, injecting a false brightness into his tone. "Everything is fine. The store is fine. It's just the changing seasons. The transition is always a headache with the vendors, that's all. I'm just tired." He didn't wait for her to respond. He immediately shifted the weight of the conversation, pivoting expertly. "How was the church committee meeting today? Did you finally get the budget approved for the youth retreat?" Sarah hesitated. I saw the flash of disappointment pass through her eyes. She knew he was hiding behind a smokescreen, but she also knew the stubborn pride of the man she had married. She recognized the wall he had just erected, and she loved him too much to try and tear it down by force. She withdrew her hand and leaned back in her chair, offering a small, defeated nod. "We did," she said quietly, allowing him to change the subject. "We got it approved." For the rest of the evening, Elias successfully maintained the illusion. He asked the right questions, nodded at the right times, and kept the conversation safely anchored in the shallow waters of community gossip and household chores. He had defended his secret perfectly. He had convinced his wife to look away from the smoke. But as he sat in his own living room, surrounded by the life he had built, Elias had never felt more completely, profoundly isolated. The victory of his deception felt like a heavy stone settling deep into his stomach. When the house finally grew quiet and the lights were turned off, one by one, Elias lay on his back in the dark bedroom. Beside him, Sarah's breathing gradually slowed, falling into the soft, rhythmic cadence of deep sleep. She was resting in the peace of the life she thought they had. But Elias was wide awake. The moonlight spilled through the window blinds, casting long, prison-like shadows across the white ceiling. The house was entirely silent, save for the faint, steady ticking of the clock down the hall, mocking him with the exact same rhythm as the clock in his empty office. Every passing second was a reminder of the loan that was coming due, the grace period that was evaporating, and the fragile peace that was about to shatter. He lay perfectly still, afraid that even tossing and turning might wake his wife and prompt another question he could not answer. He stared into the darkness hour after hour, his mind racing through endless, impossible equations, knowing that the sun would soon rise, and a sleepless night, staring at the ceiling, would inevitably lead to a tense morning. When the pale gray light of dawn finally broke through the bedroom blinds. It found Elias exactly where the darkness had left him, completely consumed by his own quiet terror. The physical toll of his sleepless night had settled deep into his bones. His eyes burned, and a dull ache throbbed at the base of his skull. The morning that followed was as tense and fragile as a sheet of thin ice. Downstairs in the kitchen, the usual warm chatter of their morning routine was replaced by the sharp, echoing clinks of silverware against porcelain. Sarah moved carefully between the stove and the counter, her shoulders tight. She poured his coffee and handed him his worn travel mug, her eyes lingering on his face for just a second too long. She didn't ask him again what was wrong. She didn't have to. The silence between them was thick with the unasked questions he was desperately trying to avoid. He offered a strained, hollow apology about having an early meeting with a supplier, kissed her briefly on the cheek, and hurried out the door before the ice could break. The drive to the store was a blur. When Elias finally unlocked the heavy glass front doors of the hardware store and flipped the sign to open, he went through the motions of his morning routine, like a man walking in a dream. He turned on the lights, aisle by aisle, straightened a row of hand tools, and unlocked the cash register. For a fleeting hour, as a few early contractors trickled in for drill bits and morning conversation, he felt a dangerous illusion of control. He could smile. He could ring up a transaction. He could pretend the ground beneath his feet wasn't crumbling. But that fragile illusion shattered entirely at 9:15, pierced by the shrill, demanding ring of the old telephone in his back office. Elias stepped behind the counter, wiped his hands on his denim apron, and picked up the receiver. It was Marcus, the regional manager for Harrison Lumber, Elias's primary distributor. For over a decade, Marcus had been a friendly voice. They usually spent the first 5 minutes of any call swapping stories about their kids or talking about weekend fishing trips. But this morning, Marcus's tone was clipped formal and painfully direct. "Elias," Marcus began, clearing his throat, "I'm looking at your account. We haven't received the last 2 payments. You know I've tried to give you as much grace as I can, but corporate flagged the file this morning." Elias's stomach dropped. The heavy metal vise returned to his chest, squeezing the breath out of his lungs. He gripped the edge of the desk, leaning his weight into it. "Marcus, I know I'm behind. It's just been a slow season. The big box store out on the highway took a bite out of my spring orders, but things are turning around. I just need a little more time. Give me until the end of the month." "I can't do it, Elias," Marcus said, his voice heavy with genuine regret. "It's out of my hands now. They've locked the system. I have to freeze your account. The delivery truck scheduled for tomorrow isn't coming. There will be no more shipments of lumber roofing or drywall until the entire past due balance is cleared in full." "Marcus, please," Elias begged, his voice cracking. He hated the sound of his own desperation, the raw vulnerability bleeding into the phone line. "You can't cut me off. If I don't have lumber on the shelves, my contractors will go somewhere else. If they go somewhere else, I lose them for good. I'll never catch up. Just send tomorrow's truck. I'll get you a check by Friday. I swear it." There was a long, agonizing pause on the other end of the line. Elias could hear the quiet hum of the connection, the sound of his own future hanging delicately in the balance. "I'm sorry, Elias. Truly I am," Marcus said quietly. "But the answer is no. Call me when you can settle the balance." The line went dead with a hollow click. Elias slowly lowered the receiver back to the cradle. He stood perfectly still in the cramped, windowless office. The walls suddenly felt as though they were moving inward, inch by inch, pressing the air out of the room. The shelves of the store outside, the ones he took so much pride in keeping perfectly stocked, were about to run bare. The lifeblood of his business had just been severed. Panic, hot and suffocating, rose in his throat. "My child, I know you recognize this feeling. It is the terrifying, breathless moment when you finally realize that a storm is entirely out of your control. No matter how tightly you grip the wheel, no matter how fiercely you try to steer your life toward safety, the waves are simply too high. You spend so much of your life building little kingdoms, convincing yourself that if you just work hard enough, plan carefully enough, and worry long enough, you can manage the weather of your own life. You forget your own human frailty. You forget that you were never designed to command the wind and the sea. You were designed to lean on my provision. But when the winds howl and the boat begins to take on water, your first instinct is rarely to wake me. Your first instinct is to grab a bucket and start bailing the water yourself, exhausting your spirit, trying to save a ship that I could steady with a single whisper. Elias was drowning, and instead of calling out for my rescue, he frantically searched for another way to bail the water. He could not accept defeat. He could not bear the thought of going home to Sarah and admitting that the business he had built for them was collapsing. He sat down heavily in his worn office chair and pulled his laptop toward him. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely strike the keys. He opened a web browser and navigated to a site he had seen advertised late at night. It was an online lender, the kind of institution that preyed on desperate people with astronomical interest rates. For years, Elias had scoffed at these places, warning young contractors never to get caught in their traps. But today, the trap looked like a life raft. He clicked the button to apply for a personal loan. The screen glowed with forms asking for details he had always kept strictly separated from his business. Because the store's credit was ruined, he could not borrow under the LLC. If he wanted this money, he had to use his own name. He had to put his personal social security number on the line. He had to list the home he shared with Sarah as a secondary asset. I watched him stare at the blinking cursor on the screen. I saw the fierce, chaotic battle raging in his mind. He knew this was reckless. He knew that tying their personal finances to a dying business was a dangerous gamble that could cost them everything they owned. But the blinding fear of immediate failure overpowered the quiet voice of wisdom. He typed in his name. He typed in their home address. He checked the boxes, blindly agreeing to interest rates that would compound his debt into an unmanageable mountain. He did it all quickly, frantically terrified that if he paused for even a second, he might lose his nerve. With one final trembling press of his finger against the mouse pad, he submitted the application. The screen loaded for what felt like an eternity, a spinning circle testing the very limits of his fractured nerves. Then the screen flashed green. Approved. The funds would be wired into his account by the end of the business day. It was enough to pay Harrison Lumber. It was enough to get the delivery truck back on the route for tomorrow morning. Elias slumped back in his chair, exhaling a massive, shuddering breath. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead with the back of his trembling hand. For a fleeting, intoxicating moment, the suffocating pressure in the room dissipated. He had done it. He had bought himself more time. The shelves would not go empty. The contractors would not leave. The mask of the successful, capable provider could remain securely in place. But my child, the relief that comes from relying on your own desperate understanding is always painfully temporary. It is a fragile bandage placed over a deep bleeding wound. As Elias sat there staring at the bright green word on his computer screen, the initial rush of salvation began to evaporate, rapidly replaced by a cold, sickening dread. He had just placed his family squarely in the crosshairs of his own failure, and he had done it entirely in secret. He thought of Sarah sitting at the kitchen table that morning, her eyes full of quiet, trusting concern. He had looked into those eyes and lied to her, and now he had just gambled their future to maintain that lie. The heavy weight of the unpaid business bills had been lifted for a moment, only to be instantly replaced by a new, infinitely heavier burden. The temporary relief of the loan faded into the shadows of the cramped office, leaving Elias entirely alone with a crushing, suffocating guilt. He could not remain in that office for another second. The familiar walls of the hardware store spaces that had once filled him with a deep and quiet pride now felt like the cold, narrowing confines of a prison cell. Elias grabbed his worn brass keyring from the desk, his movements sharp and frantic, and hurried past the quiet aisles. He pushed through the heavy glass front doors and walked briskly around to the side alley where his old pickup truck was parked in the afternoon shadow of the building. He pulled open the heavy metal door, climbed into the driver's seat, and slammed it shut, sealing himself inside the stale, cold air of the cab. He did not put the key into the ignition. Instead, he gripped the top of the steering wheel with both hands, resting his forehead against the cracked leather cover. His breathing was shallow and uneven, catching in his throat as the adrenaline of the loan application violently drained from his system. leaving behind a bitter metallic taste. The silence inside the parked truck was absolute heavy, with the terrifying reality of what he had just done. He had crossed a dangerous line. He had quietly mortgaged his family's safety to protect his own pride. It was in that suffocating quiet that Elias finally decided to speak to me. For the first time in weeks, he closed his tired eyes, bowed his heavy head, and attempted to pray. "Lord," he whispered, his voice trembling in the empty cab, "Lord, you know I'm trying. You know I'm just trying to take care of Sarah and the kids. I didn't want to take this loan, but I didn't have a choice. They were going to cut me off. Please just bless this money. Keep the store running. Let the spring orders come in strong next week. Give me enough to pay this off quickly before Sarah ever has to find out. Just fix this one thing, smooth this over, and I swear I'll never get behind again. Amen." I was right there beside him in that cold truck cab. I heard every single word that fell from his lips, and my heart ached for him. "But my child, you must understand the true nature of what was happening in that moment. Elias was not offering me a genuine prayer of surrender. He was not laying his brokenness at my feet or asking for the courage to walk in the light. He was offering a transaction. He was attempting to hand me a blueprint of his own deception and asking me to bless the architecture. My child, how often have you found yourself sitting in your own version of that parked truck praying the exact same way? How many times have you come to me with a heart full of conditions, asking me to quickly resolve the consequences of a mess you are still desperately trying to control? You ask me to heal the wounds you refuse to uncover. You ask me to bring peace to a secret you absolutely refuse to confess. You want the comfort of my presence, but you want to keep the heavy armor of your pride strapped tightly to your chest. You want me to quietly sweep the storm away so you can continue pretending to the world that you were never caught in the rain. But true prayer requires a terrifying, beautiful honesty. It is not merely a request for a quick, painless fix. It is an open, vulnerable surrender of the heart. My word tells you that I resist the proud, but I give grace to the humble. I do not resist the proud because I am angry with them, nor do I turn away out of frustration. I resist the proud because pride acts as a locked door from the inside. When you hold on to your pride, when you insist on managing your own image and hiding your failures in the dark, you are holding a heavy iron shield over your own heart. My grace falls like rain constantly and generously. But as long as you hold that shield of pride, the grace cannot soak into the dry, cracked soil of your spirit. Humility is simply the courageous act of lowering the shield. It is the willingness to say, "I am broken, I have failed, and I cannot fix this on my own." But Elias was keeping his shield raised high. His prayer was hollow because it lacked the one thing I desire most from you, the simple, unvarnished truth. After whispering his hollow, "Amen," Elias sat perfectly still, his hand still gripping the steering wheel. He waited. He waited for a physical sensation of relief. He waited for the crushing weight in his chest to suddenly evaporate, expecting a sudden wave of divine peace to wash over his anxious mind, validating his reckless choices. He expected the heavy guilt of the predatory loan to simply vanish, replaced by a quiet reassurance that he had done the noble, necessary thing for his family. But the peace did not come. The air in the cab remained just as heavy. The rhythmic ticking of the cooling engine was the only sound that answered him. The guilt still sat like a cold stone in his stomach. To Elias, that profound silence felt like a stinging personal rejection. He opened his eyes and stared blankly at the dusty dashboard, a sudden surge of deep frustration rising in his throat. He mistook my quiet, waiting for absence. He thought that because I did not instantly endorse his secrecy and remove the consequences of his hidden choices, I had simply turned my back on him. He felt an intense spiritual emptiness, a vast and echoing chasm between his heart and mine. In his mind, he had reached out in his darkest hour, and heaven had remained entirely silent. He did not realize that the terrible distance he felt was not created by my absence, but by the thick, impenetrable walls of the secret he refused to let go of. I was standing right beside him, holding out a lifeline of grace, but his hands were too full of his own pride to take hold of it. The frustration quickly hardened into a cold, bitter resolve. Elias wiped a trembling hand roughly across his face, rubbing the physical exhaustion from his eyes. His mind, desperate for a way out of the emotional pain, began to rationalize the silence. If God was not going to send a miracle to fix the ledger, he reasoned then, God must expect him to handle the mess on his own. He leaned heavily into the oldest, most deceptive lie of the proud heart. The belief that true strength means carrying your burdens entirely alone. He convinced himself that a real man, a true provider, does not wait around for divine intervention when his family is on the line. He decided that his hollow prayer had been a momentary lapse in judgment, a weak grasp at a lifeline he didn't actually need. "Fine," he muttered to the empty cab, his voice tight with defensive anger and lingering fear. "I'll figure it out. I always do." He shoved the key into the ignition and twisted it hard. The old engine roared to life, a loud mechanical distraction from the terrifying spiritual quiet of his own soul. He shifted the truck into gear, his jaw set in a rigid line of pure, stubborn determination. He had made his choice. He was going to carry the weight, manage the lie, and pay off the loan, even if the sheer pressure of it destroyed him in the process. Elias pressed his foot down on the accelerator, steering the truck out of the shaded alleyway and merging into the steady afternoon traffic heading into town while feeling entirely, profoundly abandoned. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky by the time Elias returned to the hardware store, casting long golden beams of light through the large front windows. The dust motes danced slowly in the air, illuminated like tiny suspended stars against the backdrop of the quiet aisles. He parked his truck in its usual spot, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment, letting the heavy mechanical silence wash over him. The false, frantic adrenaline that had fueled his desperate loan application had entirely burned away, leaving behind a profound and hollow exhaustion. His limbs felt as though they were filled with lead, and the dull ache at the base of his skull had bloomed into a steady, rhythmic pounding. He walked back through the front doors, the little brass bell jingling brightly above his head, a cheerful sound that felt sharply at odds with the profound emptiness echoing inside his chest. He took his place behind the worn wooden counter, slipping his denim apron back over his head. For the next 2 hours, he played the part he had perfected. He rang up a few small purchases, a gallon of white trim paint, a handful of brass screws, a replacement filter for a lawnmower. He smiled. He offered the correct change. He gave polite, measured answers about the unseasonably warm weather, but he was operating like a ghost, haunting his own life. His physical body was standing at the register, but his mind was trapped in the dark, spiraling labyrinth of his own making, terrified of the rapidly approaching moment when the new, high-interest loan would demand its first payment. He felt invisible in his suffering, completely isolated in a town full of people he had known his entire life. "But my child, I never leave you to walk through the wilderness unobserved. When you feel the most abandoned, when you believe that the heavens have turned to brass, and your prayers are merely bouncing off the ceiling, I am already moving pieces into place. I do not always answer a desperate heart with a parting of the sea or a voice thundering from the clouds. More often than not, I answer the silent cries of my children by sending a quiet, ordinary lifeline wrapped in the familiar face of a friend, a neighbor, or a passing stranger. I send someone to look closely when the rest of the world is rushing by." The brass bell above the door jingled again, breaking the heavy stillness of the store. Elias looked up instinctively, pulling the corners of his mouth into his practiced customer service smile. Walking through the door was Walter. He was a man deeply woven into the fabric of the town, an elderly retired farmer who had been coming to this very hardware store since Elias's father had owned it. Walter moved with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had spent 78 years walking across uneven fields and carrying heavy bales of hay. He wore his usual faded flannel shirt tucked neatly into worn denim jeans and a weathered green baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. His hands were thick and calloused, scarred by decades of honest, relentless labor. But it was Walter's eyes that set him apart. They were a piercing pale blue, framed by deep sun-baked wrinkles, and they held the quiet, steady wisdom of a man who understood the unpredictable seasons of life. He knew what it meant to watch a crop fail, despite doing everything right, and he knew the deep abiding patience required to wait for the rain. Walter did not head down the aisles. He walked directly to the front counter, his heavy boots scuffing softly against the linoleum. He didn't have anything in his hands to purchase. He simply stepped up to the register, rested his forearms on the scratched wooden surface, and looked directly at Elias. "Afternoon, Walter," Elias said, his voice carrying the forced breezy tone he used to keep the world at arm's length. "What can I help you find today? We just got a new shipment of those garden hoses you were looking at last week." Walter didn't answer right away. He didn't look at the displays, and he didn't offer a polite comment about the weather. He simply kept his pale blue eyes fixed on Elias's face. He studied the dark bruised shadows beneath Elias's eyes. He noticed the rigid tension in the younger man's jaw, the slight involuntary tremor in the hands resting on the cash register, and the way the forced smile did not reach anywhere near Elias's eyes. "My child, it is a rare and beautiful thing to be truly seen. Most people in this world look at you, but they only see the surface. They see the clothes you wear, the job you perform, the polite smile you offer. But when I send someone to bear your burdens, I give them the eyes to see the heavy, invisible stones you are carrying." Walter possessed those eyes. "I don't need a hose today, Elias," Walter said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried the gentle weight of a warm blanket. "I just came in to check on you." Elias blinked, entirely thrown off balance. His practiced script faltered. "Check on me. I'm fine, Walter. Just fine. You know how it is. The spring rush is starting to pick up, and the inventory is keeping me on my toes." Walter slowly shook his head, refusing to accept the polite dismissal. He leaned in a fraction closer, lowering his voice so that it was meant only for Elias. "I've known you since you were a boy, running down these aisles, Elias. I knew your father. I know the look of a man who is exhausted from working, and I know the look of a man who is exhausted from worrying. You look like you're trying to hold up the entire sky all by yourself." Elias felt his breath catch sharply in his throat. The words struck the thick iron walls of his pride with the force of a hammer. For a split second, the heavy, suffocating mask he had been wearing all day slipped. His eyes watered, burning with the sudden, overwhelming pressure of the truth. He felt a desperate, terrifying urge to open his mouth and let it all spill out onto the counter, to tell this wise, patient old man about the final notices, the empty bank accounts, the predatory loan, and the deep, paralyzing shame of failing his family. In that quiet, suspended moment, Elias experienced a profound spark of comfort. The sheer relief of simply being noticed, of having someone acknowledge his invisible agony, felt like a breath of fresh air in a burning room. I was gently pressing on his heart, inviting him to release the valve. "I have commanded you to bear one another's burdens, and in doing so, fulfill the law of Christ. You are not meant to pull the heavy plow of life entirely alone. When you fall, you need a brother to help you up." Walter was standing there, his hands resting on the counter, offering his strong, capable shoulders to help carry the load. But the fear of exposure is a powerful, blinding force. Elias looked into Walter's kind eyes, and instead of seeing a lifeline, his pride showed him a mirror of his own inadequacy. If he admitted the truth to Walter, the illusion would shatter. He would go from being the successful, reliable hardware store owner to a cautionary tale, a man who couldn't even keep his father's legacy afloat. The pride surged back, thick and defensive, rebuilding the wall before it could fully crumble. Elias cleared his throat, blinking rapidly, and straightened his posture. He reached for a rag and began to wipe down a perfectly clean section of the counter, needing a physical action to ground himself. "I appreciate that, Walter. Truly I do," Elias said, his voice tight but steady, carefully reconstructing the boundary between them. "But it's just business. You know how the margins are these days. Just a few late nights going over the books. Nothing I can't handle." Walter watched him wipe the counter, his expression softening into a look of deep, knowing sorrow. He recognized the pride. He recognized the stubborn refusal to accept grace. He had seen it in himself as a younger man, fighting a drought and refusing the help of his neighbors until his fields were nothing but dust. He knew that he could not force Elias to open his hands. Walter slowly pushed himself up from the counter and adjusted the brim of his green cap. He did not press further. He did not offer unwanted advice or demand an explanation. He simply offered his presence and his peace. "All right, son," Walter said gently. "I'll leave you to it. But you remember this. There ain't no shame in asking for a hand when the wagon gets stuck in the mud. We all hit the mud eventually. If you ever need an ear, or a cup of coffee, or just a place to sit, where you don't have to pretend everything is perfect, my front porch is always open." Walter turned and walked slowly toward the front doors. Elias stood frozen behind the register, the damp rag clutched tightly in his hand, watching the old farmer leave. The bell jingled as the door opened and closed, and then the store was quiet again. Elias let out a long, trembling breath. He was deeply, profoundly shaken by the encounter. He felt an intense, lingering warmth in his chest, a quiet assurance that he was not entirely invisible, that someone cared enough to look past his defenses. For a few minutes he leaned against the back counter, closing his eyes, letting the gentle, perceptive kindness of Walter's words soothe his battered spirit. The crushing weight of his secret felt momentarily lighter, simply because another human being had acknowledged that he was carrying something heavy. He allowed himself to rest in that brief, comforting stillness, but the fragile peace was shattered almost instantly. The heavy glass door swung open again, breaking the silence. This time it was Dave, the local mail carrier, a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. "Afternoon, Elias," Dave called out cheerfully, walking up to the counter and dropping a thick stack of rubber-banded mail onto the wood with a heavy thud. "Looks like you got a hefty stack today. Have a good evening." "Thanks, Dave. You too," Elias murmured automatically. As the mail carrier walked out, Elias reached for the stack. He pulled off the rubber band and began sorting through the envelopes. Bills, catalogs, advertisements. He moved quickly, his mind still lingering on Walter's quiet wisdom. But then his hands stopped cold. Halfway through the pile, his fingers brushed against a thick, crisp envelope made of heavy, cream-colored paper. The return address in the top left corner was stamped in stark, formal black ink. It was from the town's central bank, the institution that held the original mortgage on the hardware store building. It was not their standard monthly statement. It was sent via certified mail, bearing the bold red stamp of the bank's legal department. Elias stared at the heavy envelope, the brief, comforting warmth of Walter's visit evaporating, instantly replaced by a cold, sharp dread that paralyzed him where he stood. He slid his trembling thumb under the thick paper flap, tearing it open with a jagged, uneven motion. He pulled out the formal letterhead, his eyes scanning the dense legal paragraphs until they locked onto the bold, unforgiving text at the center of the page. It was a formal notice of review. The bank had flagged his account due to the consecutive missed payments on the building's mortgage. They were demanding an in-person meeting the following week to discuss the terms of default. If the arrears were not brought current, they would begin the foreclosure process on the property. The air in the store suddenly felt too thin to breathe. The predatory loan he had taken out just hours ago, the one that had mortgaged his own home, was barely enough to cover the lumber supplier. It wouldn't even touch the bank's demands. He was trapped in a burning room, and every door he tried to open was securely locked from the outside. He folded the heavy cream paper with stiff mechanical movements, slipped it into his back pocket, and walked through the rest of the afternoon in a state of quiet, suffocating shock. By the time Elias arrived home that evening, the sheer pressure of his secret had turned his spirit into a tightly coiled spring. Every muscle in his back was drawn tight, and a low, persistent headache throbbed behind his eyes. He walked through the front door, the hinges squeaking softly in the quiet house. "My child, I have seen how fear operates when it is kept hidden in the dark. It never simply remains fear. When you swallow your pain and refuse to let anyone help you carry it, that pain does not disappear. It ferments. It sours into a deep toxic bitterness that eventually looks exactly like anger. You become a fragile, overfilled vessel, and the slightest bump will cause the boiling water inside to spill over, scalding the very people who are standing closest to you. I have asked you to put away all bitterness, wrath, and anger, not simply because they are destructive, but because they are terrible disguises for a wounded heart. When you hide your true struggles, you inevitably punish your loved ones for a war they do not even know you are fighting. Elias stepped into the kitchen, dropping his keys onto the counter with a heavy clatter. Sarah was standing near the sink sorting through the day's mail and a small stack of household receipts. The kitchen smelled of roasted vegetables and warm bread, a domestic tranquility that felt entirely foreign to the chaos raging inside his mind. "Hi, honey," Sarah said softly, glancing over her shoulder. Her voice carried the same cautious, measured tone she had used the night before, the sound of a woman walking on eggshells in her own home. "Long day." "The usual," Elias muttered, opening the refrigerator and staring blankly at the shelves without truly seeing anything. Sarah turned around, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Elias, I called the repairman about the washing machine today. The drum is completely off balance, and he said the motor is burning out. It's going to be about $300 to fix it, or we could just put that money toward a new one. I was looking at a few models online that are on sale until Sunday." It was a completely ordinary question. It was a minor routine household expense that they had navigated 100 times before over the course of their 22-year marriage. But to Elias, standing in the cold light of the open refrigerator, with the bank's foreclosure threat burning like a coal in his back pocket, the mention of $300 felt like a physical blow. The tightly coiled spring snapped. He slammed the refrigerator door shut, the glass jars rattling violently inside. "A new one!" He snapped, his voice sharp and incredibly loud in the quiet kitchen. "Are you kidding me, Sarah? We don't have the money to just run out and buy a brand new appliance every time something makes a funny noise." Sarah flinched, stepping back against the counter as if he had physically struck her. Her eyes widened in shock. "Elias, I didn't say we had to buy a new one right this second. I was just giving you the options. The repairman said—" "I don't care what the repairman said," Elias interrupted, his voice rising, fueled by the terrifying invisible pressure he was carrying. "I am killing myself down at that store trying to keep a roof over our heads, and the second I walk through the door, you're handing me another bill. I can't do it, Sarah. Do you hear me? I cannot pay for everything." The words echoed off the kitchen walls, leaving a harsh, ringing silence in their wake. Elias stood there, his chest heaving, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. He watched the shock in Sarah's eyes slowly melt into a deep, profound hurt. "My child." I felt the exact moment his heart broke, recognizing what he had just done. He was not angry with Sarah. He was furious with himself. He was terrified of the bank, terrified of the loan, and utterly disgusted by his own failure. But because his pride refused to let him confess the truth, his fear lashed out at the safest person in the room. Unprocessed pain always finds a target, and it is almost always the one who loves you the most. Sarah did not raise her voice to match his. She did not yell back. She simply stood there, gripping the dish towel, her knuckles turning white. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled, carrying a quiet, devastating sorrow. "I have never asked you to pay for everything, Elias," she whispered, a single tear escaping the corner of her eye and tracking slowly down her cheek. "I have only ever asked you to be my partner, but you aren't here anymore." Elias's jaw tightened. The urge to defend himself flared, but her quiet grief extinguished it instantly. "I'm standing right in front of you," he said, though his voice had lost its aggressive edge, replaced by a hollow defense. "No," Sarah said, shaking her head slowly. She tossed the dish towel onto the counter, creating a physical boundary between them. "Your body is here, but you have been gone for months. You snap at me over nothing. You stare through me when I talk to you. You lie awake all night, and you won't tell me why. I don't care about the washing machine, Elias. I care about my husband. I care about the fact that you are drowning in something, and you would rather push me away and yell at me than let me help you." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any crack in the armor, any sign that he would finally step into the light. I was waiting with her. I was gently nudging his spirit, whispering, "Tell her. Let the burden fall. Let her love you in the broken places. Elias looked at the tears shining on her cheek, and a wave of intense, sickening guilt washed over him. He hated himself for raising his voice. He hated that he had made her cry. The protective walls he had built were not keeping his family safe. They were actively causing the very pain he was trying to prevent. He took a hesitant step forward, reaching out a calloused hand toward her. "Sarah, I'm sorry," he stammered, his voice thick with genuine regret. "I shouldn't have yelled. That wasn't fair. I didn't mean it." She didn't pull away when he gently touched her arm, but she didn't lean into him either. The physical space between them felt like a massive, unbridgeable canyon. "Then what is it, Elias?" She pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, tell me what is happening." He looked into the eyes of the woman he cherished more than his own life. The truth was right there, pressing desperately against his teeth. He could feel the heavy paper of the bank notice resting in his pocket. He could end the isolation right in this very kitchen. But the shame was too thick. The lie had gone on too long. He convinced himself that if he told her about the impending foreclosure and the predatory loan in the middle of an argument, it would break her completely. He convinced himself that he just needed a few more days to fix it. Elias swallowed hard, carefully rebuilding the wall he had just dented. He pulled his hand back, lowering his gaze to the scuffed linoleum floor. "It's just the stress of the store." He lied, his voice flat and perfectly controlled. "The suppliers have been difficult lately, and inventory is backed up. I took it out on you, and I am so sorry. I'm just tired. I promise I'll figure it out. Sarah stared at him for a long, silent moment. She recognized the retreat. She saw the heavy iron door of his pride, swinging shut, locking her out once again. The hope that had briefly flickered in her eyes slowly faded, replaced by a resigned, quiet grief. She nodded slowly, wrapping her arms across her own chest. "Okay, Elias," she whispered, turning away from him. "Your dinner is in the oven." She walked quietly out of the kitchen, her footsteps fading softly up the wooden stairs. Elias was left standing entirely alone in the bright, warm light of the room. The silence she left behind was far heavier than any argument could ever be. He felt a sharp physical ache in his chest, a bleeding wound caused entirely by his own stubborn hand. He had successfully defended his secret, but the victory tasted like ash. He could not bring himself to open the oven. He could not stomach the thought of eating. The walls of the house felt too close, the air too thick, with the heavy consequences of his pride. Elias turned, opened the side door of the kitchen, and stepped out into the cool, dark evening. He walked slowly down the short concrete path, the gravel crunching softly beneath his boots, and pulled open the heavy wooden door of the detached garage, stepping inside to seek the empty, quiet solitude of the shadows. The heavy wooden door closed behind him with a dull, echoing thud, sealing him in the dim, stale air of the detached garage. The sudden silence was absolute, a stark and lonely contrast to the ringing tension he had just left behind in the kitchen. He stood perfectly still for a long moment, letting his eyes adjust to the deep, heavy shadows. The air in the garage was cold, carrying the familiar grounding sense of spilled motor oil, damp earth, and old decaying cedar wood. He reached up into the darkness and pulled the frayed string of the single overhead light bulb. It flickered to life with a low electrical hum, casting a weak yellow pool of light that barely reached the far corners of the cluttered space. Elias did not want to think. He did not want to feel the sharp bleeding wound of the argument he had just caused with Sarah, nor did he want to face the terrifying reality of the certified bank notice resting like a heavy stone in his back pocket. He needed an immediate distraction. When a man feels that the foundation of his life is entirely out of his control, he will instinctively seek out something small and insignificant to master. Elias walked over to a disorganized stack of cardboard boxes in the far corner, determined to lose himself entirely in the mindless physical labor of clearing out old inventory and forgotten household items. "My child, I watch you do this very thing when the emotional weight of your circumstances becomes too heavy to bear. When the pressure of your secret struggles threatens to break you, you retreat into your own quiet spaces, desperately trying to organize the outward chaos while the internal storm continues to rage. You immerse yourself in endless tasks, believing that if you can just keep your hands busy and your mind occupied, your heart will somehow forget its pain. You think that solitude will protect you, but without my presence, isolation is simply an empty room where your fears echo far louder than before. Elias stripped off his light jacket and tossed it over a rusted metal workbench. He began to drag the heavy, dust-covered boxes across the cold concrete floor. His breath formed small, pale clouds in the chilly air as he worked the physical exertion, sending a warm, numbing exhaustion through his limbs. He moved heavy, rusted paint cans, stacks of yellowed newspapers tied with twine, and tangled coils of thick extension cords. For nearly an hour, the only sounds in the garage were the rough scraping of cardboard against concrete and his own ragged, uneven breathing. He reached down to lift a particularly large water-damaged box that had been sitting directly on the damp floor for years. He gripped the weakened sides and hauled it upward with a sharp grunt of effort. But the decaying cardboard could not hold the weight. The bottom of the box tore completely open with a loud, sudden rip. A chaotic mess of old store ledgers, loose brass hardware, faded photographs, and rusted hand tools crashed onto the floor in a dusty, disorganized heap. Elias dropped the empty shell of the box and fell to his knees with a heavy, defeated sigh. The deep frustration he had been trying to outrun instantly boiled over, stinging the back of his eyes. He reached out to blindly shove the mess back together, wanting nothing more than to sweep it all away. But as his calloused hands sifted roughly through the debris, his fingers brushed against a thick, unyielding object. He paused, wiping the thick dust from his hands onto his denim jeans, and carefully pulled it from the pile. It was a large leather-bound Bible. The deep brown leather was heavily cracked and worn entirely smooth at the corners from years of constant daily use. The gold foil lettering on the spine had long since rubbed away, and the thick gold-edged pages were fragile and yellowed with age. Elias recognized it instantly. It was his father's Bible. He held it carefully in both hands, bringing it slightly closer to his face. It still carried the faint, indelible scent of sweet pipe tobacco and old dry paper. The sudden rush of nostalgia hit him like a physical blow, bringing with it a deep, profound sorrow that instantly tightened his throat. My child, faith is a legacy that can guide you back home when you are hopelessly lost. You may forget the prayers that were spoken over you when you were young, and you may wander far from the solid foundation you were given. But I never forget. I remember every single tear your parents, your grandparents, or those who loved you shed on your behalf. I often work through the generations using the quiet, steadfast faith of those who came before you to leave breadcrumbs of grace in your darkest wilderness. Elias's father had been a man of quiet, unshakable faith. Elias vividly remembered how his father used to sit behind the very same wooden counter at the hardware store reading this exact book during the slow, quiet hours of the afternoon. His father was a man who knew how to bend his knees when the burdens of providing for a family grew heavy. Elias, on the other hand, had spent his entire adult life learning only how to brace his shoulders, lock his jaw, and carry the crushing weight all by himself. With trembling hands, Elias slowly opened the heavy cover. The dry binding creaked softly in the quiet garage. As he gently turned the fragile pages, he saw his father's familiar handwriting in the margins. There were verses underlined in faded blue ink dates, recorded next to answered prayers, and small heartfelt notes of gratitude written in the narrow white spaces. It was not just a book. It was a physical map of a man's lifelong honest conversation with me. As Elias carefully turned the pages of the Psalms, a small folded piece of yellowed notebook paper slipped out from the binding and fluttered gently to the concrete floor. He set the Bible down on his knee and picked up the paper. It was brittle, the creases deep from decades of being tightly folded. He opened it slowly, afraid it might tear. The handwriting was unmistakably his father's, though the ink was slightly smudged by time. Elias read the words under the dim, flickering light. October 14th, 1992. The bank called again today. The winter was too harsh. The town is struggling, and the store is barely hanging on. I do not know how we will make the payment by the end of the month. The fear is incredibly heavy today, but I am choosing to remember God's past faithfulness to give me courage for today. He carried us through the drought of '82 when we had absolutely nothing left. He is our ultimate provider. I will not lean on my own strength or hide this struggle from my family. Lord, the store is yours. Do with it what you will. I trust you. I trust. Elias read the words again, his heart beating a frantic rhythm against his ribs. It was a voice from the past, speaking directly into the absolute center of his present terror. A glimmer of gentle hope flickered to life in the cold garage. If his father had faced this exact same fear, this exact same devastating threat from the bank, and found a way through by simply surrendering it to me, perhaps there was a way out for Elias too. Perhaps he did not have to drown in this suffocating secret. But the moment the hope sparked, the dark, heavy shadow of his pride rushed in to extinguish it. Elias wrestled bitterly with the memory of his father's deep surrendered faith, compared to his own current paralyzing lack of trust. His father had been a good man, an honest man, who kept his family in the light. Elias felt he had already ruined everything. He felt the heavy cream envelope from the bank pressing against his leg, a sharp physical reminder of the predatory loan he had taken in secret, and the harsh, unforgiving words he had just spoken to his wife. He felt utterly unworthy of this beautiful legacy of faith. He stared at his father's bold, trusting signature at the bottom of the note, a single hot tear escaping his eye and falling to leave a dark, damp circle on the dusty concrete floor. But he could not bring himself to yield. The defensive wall he had built was still too thick, the fear of judgment too loud, and the shame of his deception too incredibly heavy to simply lay down. Elias carefully folded the brittle yellow paper along its original creases. He tucked it securely back between the pages of the Psalms, closed the heavy leather cover of the Bible, and stood up. His knees ached from the cold floor. He walked over to a high wooden shelf above the workbench, wiped away a thick layer of dust with his forearm, and placed the Bible there safely out of reach. He was not yet ready to step into the light. He reached up and pulled the chain on the overhead bulb, plunging the garage back into complete suffocating darkness. He walked back to the house, leaving the gentle whisper of the past behind him in the shadows. The rest of the weekend passed in a heavy, agonizing blur of silence and avoidance. Elias and Sarah moved around each other like ghosts in their own home, the unspoken tension hanging thickly in the air between them. He counted the hours, dreading the inevitable dawn, until Monday morning arrived, bringing the final financial blow. The gray, unforgiving light of that Monday morning washed over the town in a cold drizzle, matching the desolate chill that had taken permanent residence in Elias's chest. He did not go to the hardware store at his usual time. Instead, he drove his truck directly to the stately brick building of the town's central bank, parking in the wet lot with a stomach churning so violently he could barely stand. Inside the bank was quiet smelling of floor wax and stale coffee. Elias sat in a stiff leather chair opposite a wide mahogany desk. Behind the desk sat Arthur Vance, a senior loan officer Elias had known for over a decade. They had coached Little League together. They had shared meals at town barbecues. But this morning, Arthur could not meet Elias's eyes. He kept his gaze fixed on the thick manila folder open on his desk, his hands clasped tightly together. "Elias," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, uncomfortable register, "I took your request to the review board on Friday afternoon. I argued for you. I reminded them of your father's history with us and your perfect payment record before this year." Arthur paused, exhaling a heavy, defeated breath. "But the numbers are just too far gone. You are 90 days in arrears. They denied the extension." Elias gripped the wooden armrest of his chair. The room seemed to tilt slightly. "Arthur, please. I just need 30 more days. The spring inventory is on the floor. The contractors are booking jobs. I can bring it current." Arthur slowly shook his head, finally looking up. His eyes were filled with a terrible, helpless pity. "It's out of my hands, Elias. The legal department has already processed the paperwork. The foreclosure proceedings will be officially filed by Wednesday. I'm so sorry. There are no more options. My child." I was there in that sterile, quiet office, standing right beside him, as the floor completely fell out from beneath his feet. I felt the exact moment the final spark of his frantic, desperate hope was extinguished. The heavy iron doors of his own self-reliance were finally slammed shut and bolted. He had calculated, he had worked, he had borrowed, and he had lied, all in a desperate attempt to outrun this exact moment. But human strength always has an expiration date. Elias walked out of the bank in a blinding daze. The cold rain soaked into his flannel shirt, but he did not feel it. He climbed into the cab of his truck and slammed the door, sealing himself inside the quiet hum of the storm. He reached into his pocket with trembling fingers and pulled out his phone. The screen illuminated the dim cab with a bright, glaring notification. It was an automated alert from his personal checking account. The high-interest online loan he had taken out just days prior, the desperate secret gamble he had made to keep his supplier at bay, had initiated its first automatic withdrawal. The exorbitant interest rate had compounded over the weekend, and the payment was nearly double what he had originally calculated in his frantic state. The digital numbers stared back at him in stark red. His account was severely overdrawn. Every single dollar he had to his name was gone. Absolute suffocating panic descended upon him like a physical weight. Elias dropped the phone onto the passenger seat. He grabbed the steering wheel, his knuckles turning stark white, and bent his head, gasping for air that suddenly felt too thin to breathe. His chest heaved with dry, jagged sobs. He was entirely, mathematically ruined. The store was gone. The bank was coming for the building. The predatory lenders would soon come for his home. The elaborate, exhausting mask he had worn to protect his pride was about to be ripped away, exposing his total failure to Sarah, to his children, and to the entire town. My child, there is a distinct, terrifying season in life when you realize that every single escape route has been cut off. You look to your right, and the path is blocked. You look to your left, and the walls are closing in. You reach into your own reserves of strength, your own cleverness, your own ability to fix things, and you find that the well is completely dry. You feel utterly overwhelmed, drowning in the consequences of your own choices or the crushing weight of circumstances you cannot control. You cry out in panic, believing that because you have reached the end of your options, you have reached the end of your life. But listen closely to my voice. The end of yourself is not a place of destruction. It is the exact coordinate where my grace finally begins. When your heart is entirely overwhelmed, when the waters rise above your head, that is the moment you must cry out to be led to the rock that is higher than you. I do not allow you to reach these breaking points to punish you. I allow the false foundations of your pride to crumble so that you will finally step off the shifting sand and stand upon the solid rock of my provision. As long as you believe you can save yourself, you will never truly reach for my hand. Sometimes the heavy burden must crush your pride completely before your heart is open enough to receive my peace. Elias sat in the cold, idling truck for nearly an hour, the rain drumming a chaotic, relentless rhythm against the windshield. The frantic, buzzing energy of his anxiety began to slowly burn itself out, leaving behind a vast, hollow emptiness. He shifted the truck into drive and drove slowly back to the hardware store. He did not turn on the main overhead lights when he walked through the front doors. The aisles were cast in deep gray shadows. The familiar smells of sawdust and brass polish, which had once filled him with such profound pride, now only smelled like an ending. He walked past the neat rows of hand tools and the stacked gallons of paint, trailing his calloused hand along the edges of the metal shelving. This place was his father's legacy, and it had been his entire identity for 15 years. But the desperate need to defend it had poisoned his spirit and fractured his marriage. Elias stepped into his cramped back office. He didn't sit down at the desk. He stood in the center of the room looking at the heavy-bottomed drawer where he had hidden the mounting pile of past-due bills. He slowly walked over, gripped the handle, and pulled it open. He reached into the dark space and pulled the thick, rubber-banded stack of red stamp notices out into the open air. He placed them gently on the center of his scarred metal desk. He looked at the mountain of debt, and for the first time in months, he did not try to run a calculation. He did not try to invent a new lie. He did not search for a hidden angle or a magical solution. The fight simply left his body. His shoulders, which had been drawn tight with defensive tension for weeks, dropped heavily. The thick iron shield of his pride, the armor he had carried at the expense of his own soul, cracked down the center and shattered into 1,000 useless pieces on the linoleum floor. He was a broken man, stripped of his titles, his business, and his carefully curated image. He finally accepted the undeniable truth: he had failed. He had failed to save the store. He had failed to protect his family's finances. He had failed to be the invincible provider he thought he had to be. But my child, in the quiet, shattered space where his pride used to live, a strange and fragile clarity began to bloom. By accepting his complete defeat, he was no longer required to defend the lie. The terrifying exhaustion of pretending was suddenly over. He didn't have to put on the brave face anymore. He didn't have to smile at the customers and pretend the ground wasn't collapsing beneath him. The worst had finally happened, and yet his heart was still beating. He was still breathing. Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out the brass key ring. He detached the heavy square key that belonged to the front door of the store, leaving only the keys to his truck and his home. He laid the store key on top of the stack of unpaid bills. It was a physical surrender, a quiet relinquishing of the idol he had built with his own two hands. He turned around and walked out of the office, leaving the door wide open. He walked down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing in the quiet, shadowy building for the last time as the owner. He reached the front doors, stepped out into the cold afternoon rain, and pulled the doors shut. The heavy deadbolt clicked into place with a final, echoing finality. He reached up and flipped the plastic sign in the window from open to closed, leaving it there in the middle of the day. Elias pulled his collar up against the rain and walked slowly toward his worn pickup truck. He climbed inside, the damp chill of the weather settling deep into his clothes. He put the key into the ignition, the engine roaring to life with a familiar, steady rumble. He shifted the truck into gear and pulled out of the lot, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. The suffocating weight of the secret was still there, but the desperate need to carry it alone had been broken. He turned the truck onto the wet gray asphalt, beginning the long, slow drive home to face the music. The drive back to his neighborhood was a blur of slick asphalt and smeared streetlights. The worn windshield wipers of his pickup truck beat a steady, hypnotic rhythm, pushing the cold rain aside in sweeping mechanical strokes. Every turn, every stoplight, every familiar intersection was a stark reminder of the life he had known, a life that was now fundamentally and permanently altered. When Elias finally turned onto his quiet street, the heavy gray clouds were hanging low, mirroring the suffocating darkness that had completely enveloped his mind. He pulled into his gravel driveway, the tires crunching softly beneath the weight of the heavy chassis, and brought the truck to a slow, gentle stop. He reached forward and twisted the key. The engine shuddered and died, plunging the cab into a profound, ringing silence, save for the hollow drumming of the rain against the metal roof. He did not reach for the door handle. He did not gather his things. He sat perfectly still in the driver's seat, his hands resting limply in his lap, staring blankly through the rain-streaked glass at the warm, golden light spilling from the windows of his home. Inside that house was the woman he had sworn to cherish and protect. Inside was the family he had promised to provide for. For 15 years, his entire identity had been wrapped up in being the strong, capable man who could weather any storm and carry any burden. But as he sat in the cold shadows of the truck, the terrifying reality of his failure pressed down on him with a physical, crushing weight. The store was gone. The money was gone. The desperate predatory loan had drained their last remaining safety net. The mask he had spent months desperately holding in place had finally fractured beyond repair. My child, there is a distinct, agonizing shame that accompanies the fall of a proud heart. It is the fear that when the people you love finally see the truth of your failures, they will look at you with disgust, disappointment, or pity. Elias was entirely consumed by this fear. He believed that his worth as a husband and a father was intrinsically tied to his ability to provide and protect. He was terrified of what Sarah would think of him. He was terrified that the truth would break her heart, and that she would look at the ruin he had brought to their doorstep and realize he was not the man she thought he was. He stared at the front door, his breathing growing shallow and erratic. The thick iron walls of his self-reliance, which had cracked on the floor of his office just an hour before, finally collapsed entirely. The emotional dam broke. A sharp, ragged gasp tore from his throat. Elias bowed his head, resting his forehead against the cold, hard curve of the steering wheel, and closed his eyes. The tears came not a quiet, dignified weeping, but a violent, uncontrollable deluge of raw, unvarnished grief. His broad shoulders shook with heavy, guttural sobs that echoed in the small confines of the cab. He wept for the loss of his father's store. He wept for the crushing burden of the debt. He wept for the harsh words he had spoken to Sarah in the kitchen. But most of all, he wept because he was simply profoundly exhausted from trying to carry the weight of the world all by himself. My child, you spend so much of your life terrified of your own brokenness. You view your shattered plans and your weeping heart as ultimate failures, shameful states to be avoided at all costs. You believe that you must constantly present me with a strong, perfectly assembled version of yourself, but I see it so very differently. Brokenness is not the end of your story. It is the sacred birthplace of true surrender. When the heavy stone of your pride finally shatters, it creates a clearing where my grace can land. My word promises you that I am close to the brokenhearted, and I save those who are crushed in spirit. I do not stand far off when you weep in the dark. I draw intimately near. I sat in that cold truck with Elias closer to him in his total devastating defeat than I had been in all his years of self-reliant success. For a long time, the only movement in the driveway was the steady fall of the rain and the trembling of a man who had completely run out of strength. He gripped his own hair, the tears soaking into the collar of his flannel shirt, experiencing the terrifying, agonizing release of finally letting go. Then the warm yellow porch light flicked on, cutting a bright, sharp path through the rainy twilight. The heavy front door of the house opened. Sarah stepped out onto the wooden porch, pulling a thick knit sweater tightly around her shoulders to ward off the damp chill. She had heard the familiar rumble of the truck pull into the driveway, and when the engine had cut off, but the door had not opened, her deep, intuitive knowing had taken over. She did not know about the bank, the certified letter, or the predatory loan, but she knew the heart of the man she had loved for 22 years. She knew that the terrible invisible storm he had been fighting alone had finally pulled him under. She didn't hesitate. She didn't wait on the porch for him to gather his composure. She walked down the wooden steps, the wet gravel crunching softly beneath her shoes, and approached the driver's side of the truck. The rain fell softly on her hair, but she paid it no mind. I watched her look through the rain-streaked glass, her eyes instantly finding him slumped over the steering wheel. She saw the violent shaking of his shoulders. She saw the absolute devastation radiating from him. In that moment, the frustration of his recent emotional absence and the sting of his harsh words vanished from her, completely replaced entirely by a fierce, compassionate love. Sarah reached out and grasped the metal handle of the truck door. She pulled it open, the sudden click of the latch, and the soft glow of the interior dome light illuminating the cold, damp cab. Elias flinched at the sudden light. The blinding rush of shame flared up in his chest. He turned his face away from her, burying his tear-stained face in his calloused hands. He was terrified of the judgment he was certain he deserved. He wanted to hide, to sink into the floorboards of the truck, unable to bear the thought of her witnessing his total pathetic ruin. But Sarah did not demand answers. She did not ask him where he had been, or why he was crying, or what had happened to the store. She did not ask for a single explanation. She simply stepped up onto the running board, leaned into the cold, cramped space of the cab, and wrapped her arms around his shaking shoulders. She pulled his heavy, weeping head gently against her chest, burying her face in his damp hair. She held him with a fierce, anchoring strength, pressing her warmth against his freezing despair. Elias stiffened for a fraction of a second, bracing for a reprimand or a barrage of anxious questions. But the pure, unconditional warmth of her embrace disarmed him completely. The last remaining fragments of his defenses dissolved into nothingness. He turned his face into the soft wool of her sweater and wept openly, wrapping his large arms around her waist, holding on to her as if she were the only solid thing left in a dissolving, chaotic world. She just held him, rocking him gently in the quiet space of the open truck door, murmuring soft, wordless sounds of comfort against the cold evening air. This is the profound, beautiful mirror of my grace, my child. When you finally come to the absolute end of yourself, terrified of the punishment your failures deserve, I do not meet you with folded arms and a harsh list of demands. I do not demand that you immediately explain your mess. I meet you with an open door and a gentle, enveloping embrace. I meet you in the exact center of your ruin, offering you the warmth of a love that you could never possibly earn, and therefore can never possibly lose. They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other in the dim light of the truck cab, as the rain continued to fall softly on the roof. Eventually, the heavy, ragged sobs that had racked Elias's body began to slow. The emotional storm spent its violent fury, leaving him exhausted, hollowed out, but incredibly, miraculously lighter. The secret still existed. The financial ruin was still real, but the terrifying isolation was gone. Sarah gently pulled back just enough to look at him. She reached up her thumbs tenderly, wiping the damp, cooling tears from his cheeks. She offered a soft, reassuring smile that held no judgment, only an invitation to finally step into the light. She reached down and took his large, calloused hand in hers, her grip firm and unyielding. With a gentle tug, she helped him step down from the cab and out into the cool rain. Elias did not pull away. He let her lead him. Together they walked slowly up the gravel driveway, their hands tightly locked. They climbed the wooden steps, crossed the threshold of the porch, and moved inside the warm, brightly lit house, closing the door against the cold night and walking slowly toward the kitchen table, where the long-buried truth must finally come out. The kitchen was painfully bright after the heavy darkness of the storm outside. The fluorescent light hummed quietly overhead, casting a stark, unforgiving glow over the scarred oak table where they had shared thousands of ordinary family meals. Elias pulled out a wooden chair, the legs scraping loudly against the linoleum, and sank into it. He felt as though the very bones in his legs had turned to water. Sarah sat directly across from him. She did not rush him. She folded her hands in her lap, the damp wool of her sweater smelling faintly of the rain, and waited with a quiet, terrifying patience. This was the moment of reckoning. Elias reached into the inner pocket of his wet jacket. His fingers trembled violently as they closed around the thick cream-colored envelope he had received from the bank just a few hours prior. He pulled it out, the edges slightly warped from the dampness, and laid it flat in the exact center of the table. Next, he reached into his front pocket and retrieved his phone. He unlocked the screen, his thumb shaking as he navigated to his personal banking application. The screen glowed to life, displaying a devastating, brightly lit negative balance in harsh red numbers. He set the phone gently beside the envelope. He pushed both items across the smooth wood, sliding them until they rested directly in front of his wife. These were the physical artifacts of his ruin. These were the heavy, suffocating stones he had been carrying in secret, the very things that had slowly crushed the life out of his spirit. "I lost it, Sarah." Elias whispered the words, scraping painfully against his raw throat. Once the dam was breached, the truth could no longer be contained. It rushed out of him in a desperate, broken flood. He did not look at her face. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on his own calloused hands, unable to bear the weight of her gaze. He told her everything. He spoke of the slow, agonizing decline of the hardware store's revenue over the past year. He confessed how he had started missing the mortgage payments on the building, convinced that a seasonal rush would eventually make up the difference. He laid bare the shame of the suppliers calling to cut him off the empty shelves he had tried to hide by rearranging old stock, and the suffocating panic that had driven him to sit in his office and lie to her face. Finally, with a voice so small and fractured it barely sounded like his own, he confessed the absolute worst of it. He told her about the predatory online loan. He explained how he had blindly signed his own name, leveraging their personal finances and tying the safety of their own home to the sinking ship of his business. He told her that the money was entirely gone, swallowed instantly by the compounding interest, and that the bank was formally initiating foreclosure on Wednesday. "I am so sorry." Elias choked out a fresh wave of hot tears, spilling over his eyelashes and dropping onto his hands. "I just wanted to fix it. I thought I could handle it. I wanted to be the man who protected this family, and instead, I ruined everything." He squeezed his eyes shut and braced himself. He lowered his head physically, anticipating the blow. In his mind, he had already written the script of her reaction. He expected the sudden violent scrape of her chair as she pushed away from him in disgust. He expected a sharp, righteous anger. He expected her to scream to ask him how he could have been so incredibly foolish, so deeply selfish to gamble their entire future without giving her a voice. He felt he deserved her total, unmitigated disappointment. He deserved for her to walk out of the kitchen and never look back. My child. This is the paralyzing terror of exposure. You carry your secret sins and your hidden failures, convinced that if anyone truly saw the depth of your mess, their love for you would instantly evaporate. You project your own harsh, unforgiving judgment onto the people around you, and tragically, you project it onto me. But I have given you a profound instruction in my word. Confess your trespasses to one another, and pray for one another, that you may be healed. Healing cannot begin in the dark. A wound that is bound up tight and hidden away will only fester and grow sick. It must be brought out into the open air, no matter how terribly it stings in the beginning. True confession is a terrifying leap of faith, an act of completely abandoning your defenses and trusting that grace will catch you when you fall. The kitchen remained incredibly agonizingly quiet. The only sound was the low, steady hum of the refrigerator in the corner and the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the window pane. Sarah looked down at the table. She read the stark legal words on the bank envelope. She looked at the glowing red numbers on the phone screen. The sheer magnitude of the financial disaster washed over her, an undeniable reality that threatened the very foundation of their secure, comfortable life. The shock of it caused her breath to catch in her throat. But then she looked up from the papers and looked directly at the broken, weeping man sitting across from her. She did not see a failure. She did not see a foolish man who had ruined their lives. She saw her husband, the man who had worked himself to the bone for 15 years out of a deep, profound devotion to their family. She saw the crushing, solitary agony he must have endured over the past few months, carrying this terrifying storm entirely by himself, because he loved her too much to let her worry. Her heart broke, not for the loss of the money or the store, but for the immense, unnecessary suffering Elias had endured in silence. True love. My child always meets you in your lowest, most unlovable moments. It is the clearest earthly reflection of my own unconditional grace. Sarah did not push her chair back. She did not yell. Instead, she leaned forward, reaching across the table, and placed both of her soft hands firmly over his trembling ones. Elias gasped at the sudden warm contact. He opened his eyes, blinking through the tears, completely disoriented by the gentleness of her touch. Elias, Sarah said, her voice steady, fiercely tender, and completely devoid of the anger he had braced for. Look at me. Please look at me. It took every ounce of courage he possessed, but Elias slowly raised his head. He looked into her eyes, fully expecting to see the reflection of his own shame. But there was no disgust. There was only a deep, profound, and luminous sorrow. Why? She whispered, her own tears finally spilling over and tracking softly down her cheeks. Why on earth did you think you had to carry this all by yourself? I was supposed to protect you, he sobbed, his voice breaking completely. I was supposed to provide. Sarah tightened her grip on his hands, holding him with an anchoring, unshakable strength. You are my husband, she said, her words ringing with a quiet, absolute authority in the kitchen. You are not just my provider. You are my partner. We stood at an altar 22 years ago, and we promised each other for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer. Did you think I only meant the rich parts? Elias, did you think my love for you was tied to that building downtown, or the balance in a bank account? She reached out with one hand, gently cupping the side of his rough, tear-stained face. She stroked his cheek with her thumb, brushing away the physical evidence of his fear. I am not angry about the store, Sarah continued, her voice softening into a pure healing balm over his battered spirit. I am not angry about the loan or the bank or the money. We will figure the money out. We will sell what we have to sell. We will work, and we will survive this. The only thing that breaks my heart is that you suffered in the dark, terrified of me, when I would have gladly helped you hold the weight. I forgive you for hiding it, Elias. I forgive you completely. But you must promise me right here and now that you will never shut me out like this again." Elias looked at her, entirely overwhelmed by the sheer unmerited grace shining in her face. The crushing anticipation of her wrath had been completely unfounded. She was not leaving. She was pulling him closer. In her eyes, he saw a glimmer of my own eternal forgiving love, a love that sees the absolute worst of you and chooses to stay. He nodded his head frantically, leaning his face into the warmth of her palm. The tears falling freely now washed clean of their bitter shame. "I promise," he choked out. "I promise, Sarah. I am so sorry." "We are a team," she whispered, leaning across the table to press her forehead against his, her breath warm against his skin. "You do not have to carry this alone anymore." As those words settled into the quiet space of the room, Elias felt a profound physical shift within his chest. The bank was still going to foreclose. The debt was still going to be a monumental mountain to climb. The practical earthly storm had not vanished into thin air, but the terrifying, suffocating isolation that had nearly destroyed him was gone. By stepping into the light, by laying his deepest failures on the table, and receiving unconditional forgiveness in return, the burden shared is suddenly cut in half. The kitchen remained incredibly still. The bright humming overhead light seemed softer now, reflecting off the tear-stained wood of the table, where Elias's confession still hung in the air. Elias kept his forehead pressed against Sarah's drawing in his first full, unhindered breath, in what felt like an absolute eternity. He opened his eyes and looked down at the cream-colored envelope and the glowing screen of his phone resting between them. Just an hour ago, those ordinary objects had possessed the terrifying power to completely destroy him. Now lying there in the light of his wife's forgiveness, they were simply paper and glass. The math had not changed one bit. The debt was still a towering, seemingly impossible mountain. The bank was still going to take the building, but the venom had finally been drawn out of the wound. "My child, I see how often you confuse surrender with defeat. You have been taught by a loud, demanding world that letting go is a sign of weakness, a shameful admission that you are not strong enough to finish the fight. But I tell you today that true surrender is the bravest, most courageous act your soul can ever perform. Surrender does not mean you are giving up on your life. It means you are finally handing the outcome over to the only one strong enough to hold it. You spend so much time exhausting your spirit trying to carry mountains that I only ever asked you to climb. When you finally release your grip, you are not falling into a dark abyss. You are falling directly into my hands." Elias slowly pulled back his eyes, searching Sarah's face. The harsh defensive lines of worry that had aged him over the past few months seemed to smooth out in the gentle warmth of her presence. He reached out and pushed the envelope and the phone to the far edge of the table, making a clear physical space between them. "It became an idol, Sarah," he said, his voice quiet and thick with a sudden painful clarity. "I didn't realize it until today. My father built that store, and I thought keeping it alive was the only way to prove I was a good man. I wrapped up my entire identity, my entire worth as a husband and a father, in that brick building. I was so terrified of losing it that I was willing to sacrifice you my health and our peace just to keep the doors open one more day. I made the business my god, and it demanded absolutely everything I had." Sarah nodded slowly, her thumb gently tracing the back of his calloused hand. "We build our lives on things we can see, Elias. It's human. We want security, but that store is just a building. It's just wood, concrete, and nails. It is not our foundation. Our foundation is sitting right here at this table." She looked at him with a quiet, steady resolve, her eyes shining with a fierce, protective hope. "We cannot fix this by ourselves tonight. We can't write a check to make the bank go away, and we can't undo the loan. But Elias, we do not have to carry it anymore. We need to give it back to him." Elias remembered the hollow transactional prayer he had choked out in the cold cab of his truck just days before. He had demanded a quick fix. He had asked me to endorse his pride and bless his secrets. He had wanted the pain to stop without having to change his heart. But sitting here now, stripped of his heavy armor and completely exposed to the light, his heart was entirely different. It was soft. It was finally ready to yield. He slipped his hands out from under hers and turned them over, resting his palms, face up, on the scarred oak table. It was a physical posture of absolute, unreserved release. Sarah smiled a soft, tearful expression of profound relief and placed her own hands gently over his. They bowed their heads together in the quiet warmth of the kitchen. "Lord," Elias began, his voice trembling not with fear, but with a deep, reverent sincerity. "Lord, I am so sorry. I took the beautiful blessings you gave me, and I turned them into heavy chains. I thought I could manage this life on my own. I thought my own two hands were strong enough to hold my family together without your help. I was too proud to ask for grace and too stubborn to admit I was failing. Please forgive my pride." He took a deep, shuddering breath, squeezing Sarah's hands tightly as the last walls of his resistance crumbled into dust. "Father, I am giving it all back to you. I am giving you the hardware store. I am giving you the bank notices, the empty accounts, and the predatory loan. I am laying my reputation and my pride on this table, and I am leaving them here. I do not know how we are going to survive this storm, but I know that you are in the boat with us. I cast this heavy burden onto you, Lord, because I finally know I cannot sustain it. Whatever happens next, whatever your plan is, we accept it. We trust you. Please give us the wisdom to walk through tomorrow and the peace to rest tonight. In your holy name, amen." "Amen," Sarah whispered, a single joyful tear falling onto their joined hands. "My child, I have promised you in my word to cast your burden on the Lord, and he shall sustain you. I have never promised that the moment you pray, your earthly problems will magically vanish into thin air. I do not promise that the bank will simply forget the debt or that the practical consequences of your mistakes will be instantly erased. But I promise you something far more profound. I promise to sustain your spirit. I promise to step into the roaring fire with you and take the crushing weight of the anxiety off your chest so that you can walk through the flames without ever being consumed." The moment Elias spoke that final "Amen," a miraculous physical transformation washed over his body. The heavy iron vice that had gripped his ribs for months instantly released its hold. The dull, throbbing ache at the base of his skull dissolved into complete nothingness. His lungs, which had felt restricted and shallow for weeks, suddenly expanded, pulling in a deep, cleansing breath of air. The suffocating dread of the unknown was completely replaced by a profound, unshakable, spiritual peace. He opened his eyes and looked at his wife. The kitchen was exactly the same. The bills were still sitting on the table. They would still have to make incredibly difficult phone calls the next morning. They would likely have to sell their assets, face the town's whispering gossip, and start entirely over. But the terrifying grip of the idol had been broken. The fear of failure had lost all of its terrible power over him. He realized with a sudden joyful clarity that losing the business was actually the very thing that had saved his life. It had forced him to drop his heavy shield and return to the true, eternal source of his strength. He stood up from the table, pulling Sarah up with him, and wrapped her in a long, deep embrace. They held each other not in the desperate, frantic grip of survivors clinging to wreckage, but with the steady, peaceful assurance of two people standing on solid ground. For the first time in nearly a year, Elias felt completely, wonderfully light. The exhausting performance was over. The hiding was finished. He was finally free. Later that night, Elias lay in bed next to Sarah. The rain had finally stopped, leaving a quiet, still hush over the neighborhood. He did not stare anxiously at the shadows on the ceiling. He did not count the hours or run impossible financial equations in his mind. He simply closed his eyes offered a quiet whisper of gratitude into the dark, and drifted immediately into a deep, dreamless, and beautifully restorative sleep. When the morning sun eventually crested the horizon, sending bright, hopeful rays of golden light through the bedroom window, Elias opened his eyes. He listened to the quiet, steady rhythm of his wife's breathing. He felt the soft, familiar warmth of his home, recognizing it as a gift rather than a possession he had to defend. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, feeling the cool hardwood beneath his feet, and stood up, stepping into the new day with a fully renewed mind. The morning sun did not miraculously erase the towering mountain of debt. The bank did not call with a sudden change of heart, and the unforgiving interest on the personal loan continued to silently accrue. The heavy practical work of dismantling a 15-year business still lay entirely ahead of him. But as Elias drove his truck down the familiar streets of town, the suffocating, paralyzing terror was entirely gone. He parked in front of the hardware store, the air crisp and clear. He walked into his small back office, took a large piece of bright yellow cardboard, and uncapped a thick black marker. With a steady hand, he wrote the words he had spent the last 6 months desperately trying to avoid store closing. Liquidation sale. He carried the sign to the front window, taped it securely to the inside of the glass, and stepped back to look at it. The words were stark, final, and undeniable. He felt a brief, sharp pang of grief in his chest, a natural, honest sorrow for the end of a long era. But the overwhelming shame that he had been so certain would destroy him was completely absent. The truth was finally out in the light, and it had set him free. My child, you spend so much of your precious energy bracing for the judgment of others. You convince yourself that if the people in your life truly saw your failures, they would turn away from you in disgust. You imagine the harsh whispers. You anticipate the critical, condescending stares. Elias stood behind his worn wooden counter that morning, watching the town slowly wake up, bracing his fragile spirit for the pity and the gossip. But I have woven a beautiful, profound capacity for grace into the human heart. When you finally allow yourself to be vulnerable, when you stop pretending that you have it all perfectly together, you give others the extraordinary opportunity to be my hands and my feet in your life. The little brass bell above the door jingled, breaking the quiet of the morning. Elias looked up instinctively, tensing his shoulders. It was Walter. The old farmer stepped inside, took off his weathered green baseball cap, and looked at the bright yellow sign in the window for a long, silent moment. He didn't shake his head. He didn't offer empty platitudes or awkward, uncomfortable condolences. He simply walked up to the counter, pulled a folded piece of notebook paper from the breast pocket of his flannel shirt, and set it gently on the scratched wood. Morning, Elias. Walter set his pale blue eyes steady and incredibly warm. Elias looked at the paper, then back up at the farmer. Morning, Walter. I suppose you saw the sign. I did. Walter nodded slowly. I know it hurts, son. I know it feels like the end of the world today. I nearly lost my entire farm to the bank back in the drought of '88. I thought I had failed my family. I thought I was less of a man because I couldn't make it rain. But a building is just wood and nails, Elias. And a farm is just dirt. A man who knows his trade, who knows how to treat his neighbors fair and square. That is a solid foundation you take with you wherever you go. Walter tapped the folded piece of paper with his thick, calloused finger. The county agricultural co-op needs a new supply logistics manager. I spoke to the board of directors this morning over coffee. They know your work ethic. They know your character. They are expecting your call this afternoon, and they are ready to offer you a steady salary and health benefits. Elias stared at the paper, his vision suddenly blurring with fresh, grateful tears. He had been so terrified of losing his status as the town's independent business owner, he hadn't realized that his true value to these people was never the inventory sitting on his shelves. It was his character. It was the years he had spent offering honest advice, extending grace to others, and being a faithful, reliable member of his community. Walter the First. I don't even know what to say. Elias choked out, picking up the paper as if it were made of pure gold. Thank you. Truly. You don't have to say a thing. Walter smiled gently, putting his cap back on. We carry each other, Elias. That's how we survive the mud. Over the next several weeks, the reality of that profound truth unfolded in beautiful, ordinary, and deeply practical ways. The rescue I sent for Elias and Sarah did not come in the form of a lottery ticket or a miraculous anonymous check to wipe out their debt in a single stroke. I provided a rescue that required community humility and hard work. Men from Sarah's church committee showed up on a Saturday morning with their own pickup trucks and strong backs to help Elias clear out the heavy inventory from the back warehouse. Neighbors came in and bought up the remaining stock at full price, flatly refusing the clearance discounts he tried to offer them. A retired financial advisor from their congregation sat with Elias and Sarah at their kitchen table for 3 long, tedious evenings, carefully combing through their ledgers. He helped them consolidate the predatory loan and formally negotiate a realistic, manageable payment plan with the central bank, preventing the immediate foreclosure of their home. My child, my rescue rarely looks the way you have planned it in your own mind. When you pray for deliverance from your struggles, you usually present me with a very specific blueprint of exactly how I should save you. Elias had wanted me to miraculously fill his business accounts. He wanted me to save the hardware store so he could keep his pride completely intact. But if I had simply given him the money he demanded in the cold cab of his truck that afternoon, he would have remained a permanent prisoner to his own self-reliance. He would have kept the building, but he would have lost the deep, intimate connection with his wife, his peace of mind, and his total dependence on me. I promise you in my word that I work all things together for the good of those who love me. But you must understand that the good I am fiercely working toward is not always your earthly comfort, your social reputation, or your financial success. The ultimate good I am working toward is the absolute freedom of your soul. I allowed the walls of that hardware store to fall so that Elias could finally discover that his identity was never tied to a piece of real estate. His worth as a man was never measured by a profit margin. He was finally learning to stand as a husband, a father, and a man of steadfast faith, entirely apart from the title he had so desperately defended. The liquidation process was physically exhausting, but for the first time in nearly a year, Elias and Sarah were pulling the heavy plow together. There were no more secrets hidden in the back of dark desk drawers. When the stress of the debt consolidation grew heavy and the numbers looked daunting, they did not retreat into angry, isolated silence. They sat together at the kitchen table, held each other's hands, and brought their anxieties directly to me in honest, united prayer. The burden was still difficult to carry, but it was no longer crushing them. The tense, anxious weeks slowly turned into a quiet, steady rhythm of dismantling the past and preparing for the future. Elias accepted the logistics position at the agricultural co-op. He found a strange, unexpected, and profound comfort in simply working a steady shift, clocking out at 5 o'clock, and driving home to his wife with a clear, unburdened mind. He was no longer the boss. He was no longer the sole provider carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. But as he sat at his dinner table each night, laughing with his children and holding his wife's hand, he realized he was finally truly free. On a quiet, overcast Friday evening, the hardware store was finally empty. The tall metal shelves were completely bare, swept clean of the inventory, the dust, and the lingering ghosts of his own heavy expectations. The echo of Elias's footsteps sounded entirely different now as he walked across the scuffed linoleum floor. The sound was light or hollow, but no longer haunted by the frantic ticking of the clock. He walked slowly down the center aisle one last time, pausing to look around the cavernous space. He did not feel the sharp, bitter sting of defeat. He did not feel the crushing weight of failure. He only felt a deep, abiding, and miraculous gratitude. He stepped out onto the sidewalk, pulled the heavy glass door shut behind him, and turned the key in the brass deadbolt. For the very last time, his heart resting in a profound and unshakable peace, he slipped the brass key out of the lock, the sharp metallic click echoing softly in the damp evening air. For 15 years, that specific sound had marked the absolute center of his universe. It had been the starting gun of his long, grueling days, and the heavy final period at the end of his exhausting nights. He rolled the cool metal over in his calloused palm for just a moment, acknowledging the massive, undeniable shift that had taken place in his life, and then he simply slid it into his denim pocket. He turned his back on the dark, empty windows of the building and walked across the wet asphalt toward his pickup truck. The heavy, frantic static that had violently clouded his mind for months was entirely gone. As he walked, Elias noticed the deep, vibrant green of the elm trees lining the street, their leaves washed clean by the recent rain. He heard the distant, cheerful sound of a neighbor's dog barking, and he felt the crisp, cooling breeze against his face. When anxiety holds your heart hostage, my child, it shrinks your entire universe down to the exact size of your fear. It blinds you to the ordinary, quiet beauty of the world that is continuing to spin right outside your window. But tonight, Elias's vision was finally clear. He climbed into the cab of his truck, the very same cramped space where he had once wept in absolute suffocating despair, and rested his hands lightly on the steering wheel. He looked back at the hardware store one last time. There was no terror left in his chest. The monstrous, demanding beast of his own pride had been completely dismantled. He had lost the building, but he had finally gained his soul. He had surrendered his reputation, but he had won back his marriage, his peace, and his profound life-giving dependence on me. The drive back to his quiet neighborhood was no longer a panicked, dreadful flight from reality. The worn tires hummed a steady, peaceful rhythm against the road. He did not spend the drive inventing new lies or running impossible, devastating financial equations in his head. He simply drove, listening to the quiet rumble of the engine, completely at peace with the knowledge that tomorrow would require hard work, but it would not require a performance. When he pulled into his gravel driveway, the warm, golden light spilling from the kitchen window did not look like a harsh spotlight, demanding a flawless, exhausting illusion. It looked exactly like what it was meant to be, a sanctuary. He walked up the wooden steps, opened the front door, and breathed in the comforting scent of his own home. Sarah looked up from the dining table, offering a soft, knowing smile that held no judgment and no demands. Elias did not have to pause on the porch to practice a fake brave face. He didn't have to lock his terrifying fears away in the dark. He simply took off his jacket, walked into the bright light of his home, and sat down beside the woman who loved him unconditionally. He was finally, beautifully, at rest. And now I am looking directly at you, my child. I see you sitting there listening to this story, feeling that familiar heavy ache pressing down on your own chest. I know the exact shape and the terrifying weight of the hidden stone you have been desperately carrying. Perhaps it is a staggering financial crisis that you have carefully hidden from your spouse. Perhaps it is a quiet, consuming addiction, a deep well of unprocessed grief, a massive personal failure, or a shame so thick and suffocating that you feel it tightening around your throat every single time you try to close your eyes. You have spent months, perhaps even years, carefully managing the illusion. You have convinced yourself that if you just hold on a little longer, if you just work a little harder, if you can just figure out the right angle, you can fix the mess before anyone ever finds out. You are terrified that if you finally drop the heavy stone you are carrying, it will shatter everything and everyone you love. You convince yourself that holding this toxic secret is a noble act of protection. You are paralyzed by the fear that if you let the illusion fall, if you speak the ugly truth out loud, the people you love will look at you with bitter, irreversible disappointment. But I see the devastating toll this hidden war is taking on your fragile spirit. I see how incredibly tired you are. Your shoulders are bowed beneath a weight you were never designed to support. Your joy has entirely evaporated, replaced by a constant buzzing anxiety that hums just beneath your skin. Your prayers have become frantic transactional pleas for a quick escape rather than a genuine, vulnerable surrender of your heart. You are fighting a violent, exhausting battle in the dark, a war I never asked you to fight alone. Listen to the gentle, unshakable promise I spoke into the world centuries ago. A promise that was meant specifically for you in this exact, desperate moment. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. I do not ask you to come to me only when your life is perfectly organized and your ledgers are completely balanced. I do not ask you to untangle the chaotic mess you have made before you are allowed to invite me into the room. I am calling to the weary. I am calling to the ones who are completely crushed beneath the heavy, suffocating consequences of their own pride. Surrender is not a defeat. It is not a shameful admission that you are a failure. Surrender is the breathtaking, courageous moment you finally allow yourself to be rescued. The thick iron walls you have built to protect your image are the very walls keeping you isolated from my limitless grace and from the profound, healing love of the people I have purposefully placed in your life. The heaviest weights are always the ones you refuse to share, but you do not have to carry it alone anymore. Let the exhausting illusion fall. Open the heavy locked drawer of your heart where you have hidden your deepest failures. Lay them out in the open light and take a deep, cleansing breath. My grace is vastly wider than your deepest, most terrifying mistake, and my strength is perfectly made complete in your absolute weakness. You do not have to be the savior of your own story. I have already taken that role, and my hands are more than capable of holding you through whatever practical storms come next. If you will simply let go of your fierce, stubborn need for control, you will find a peace that surpasses all earthly understanding. If you are ready to stop running, if you are finally ready to lay the heavy, useless armor down on the floor and step into the quiet, boundless safety of my presence, I invite you to open your heart right now. You do not need to use perfect, eloquent words, and you do not need to hide your tears. Close your eyes. Release the physical tension you have been holding in your hands. Take a slow, deep breath and pray these honest words with me. Heavenly Father, I come to you today completely exhausted. I have tried to carry the heavy weight of my world entirely on my own shoulders, and I can no longer pretend that I am strong enough to do this alone. I am so deeply tired of hiding my struggles in the dark. I am tired of letting my pride build a thick wall between my heart, the people I love, and your boundless grace. Today, I am making the choice to lay it all down. I surrender my secret fears, my silent failures, and my desperate, exhausting need for control. I hand over the outcomes I cannot manipulate, and the storms I cannot quiet. Please forgive my stubborn self-reliance. Wash away the bitter shame that has kept me so isolated. Give me the courage to walk in the light, to confess my brokenness to those who love me, and to receive the help you have so lovingly provided. Lord, please, step into my mess and be my solid foundation. I trust that your plans for my life are good, even when they look entirely different from my own. I gladly trade my heavy burden for your perfect peace. In Jesus' name, amen.